Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Joint Base Myer Henderson Hall. On behalf of the Joint Base Myer Henderson Hall Commander, Colonel Patrick M. Duggan, welcome to the Bakers Creek Memorial Ceremony commemorating the 74th anniversary of the air crash in Queensland, Australia, a tragedy that took the lives of 40 Army Air Corps members during World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the presentation of the colors and the singing of the national anthem, and remain standing for the invocation. The singing of the national anthem will be sung by Staff Sergeant Matthew L. Smith from the United States Army Band, Pershing's Own. The invocation will be given by Chaplain Alvaro Rivera of the 4th Infantry Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard.
Color. Ho. Oh, freeze it. Ho.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Oh, right shoulder. Ho.
Pray with me. Let us pray. Mighty God, in all things you call us to remember. Today we pause and pay tribute to those who perished on the 74th anniversary of the Bakers Creek air crash. Today we remember the military service personnel who perished in the Southwest Pacific. We recall the relentless courage, remarkable strength, and ultimate dedication to God and country. May we always hold dear the striving for peace, the will of duty, and the faith in for which they lived and died for. It was through their efforts and your grace that we persist in our freedom for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We ask that you would draw us closer to yourself and that you would bless us with the comfort and peace that only you can provide. Your word tells us that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. So Lord, bring the morning and with it the joy you have promised. May your peace be with us always. God bless our armed forces, God bless our families, and God bless the United States of America. Amen.
Oh.
Thank you, Staff Sergeant Smith and Chaplain Rivera. The aircraft, a Boeing B-17C, serial number 40-2072, known as Miss Every Mornin' Fixin', took off from Mackay Airfield just before dawn at about 6 a.m. in foggy conditions, headed for Port Moresby. Soon after, it made a low-altitude turn, and a few minutes later crashed. The cause of the crash remains a mystery, a tragedy that took the lives of 40 Army Air Corps service members during World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the wreath laying. The wreath from the Embassy of Australia will be laid by the Honorable Joe Hockey, Australian Ambassador to the United States, and Air Commodore Gary Martin, Defense Air Attaché. The wreath from Joint Base Myer Henderson Hall will be laid by Colonel Patrick Duggan, Joint Base Commander, and Miss Libby Garvey, Board Member of the Arlington County Board. Taps will be played by Sergeant First Class Matt Byrne, bugler with the United States Army Band, Pershing's Own. Placing the wreaths is in tribute to the 40 victims of the Bakers Creek tragedy. As they place the wreaths, please remember these brave Americans who gave the ultimate sacrifice. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Thank you, Ambassador Hockey, Air Commodore Martin, Colonel Duggan, Miss Garvey, and Sergeant First Class Byrne. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the Joint Base Commander of Joint Base Myer Henderson Hall, Colonel Patrick M. Duggan.
Ambassador, Air Commodore, Miss Garvey, Dr. Cutler, honored guests, good afternoon. I'm pleased and humbled to welcome you to Joint Base Myer Henderson Hall as we gather on this 74th anniversary of the airplane crash at Baker's Creek in Southwest Pacific Theater during World War II. 8 years ago, we dedicated this Baker's Creek Memorial here on Fort Myer to honor the memory of the 40 Americans who lost their lives, members of the Army Air Corps who tragically died in the airplane crash at Baker's Creek near Mackay, Queensland, Australia on June 14, 1943, following a much-deserved R&R from the fight in the Pacific. These American servicemen boarded their B-17 transport just before dawn, heading back to New Guinea. There were 6 crew members and 35 passengers on board. The plane took off in a dense fog, and for reasons still unknown today, it crashed shortly after takeoff. All were killed, except for one survivor, Corporal Foy Kenneth Roberts. This memorial is a lasting tribute to remember the loss of those 40 lives, tragically cut short that fateful day in the prime of their youth. It has been noted the historical irony that the memorial marker was placed here, next to the site of the very first military aviation crash and fatality on September 17, 1908. The memorial sits next to our suffrage gate just behind me, named for First Lieutenant Thomas Suffrage, a U.S. Army officer, the very first person to die in any airplane crash, when he and Orville Wright rode in a test flight of the Wright Flyer here on Fort Myer, when the flyer they were riding crashed as one of the propellers suddenly shattered in flight and the plane plummeted from an altitude of 75 feet in the area of the parking lot just here, right behind you. Orville Wright was severely injured, and Lieutenant Suffrage died that day in what is now my office in Building 59, right down the road. It is fitting that the memorial found its home here, as this site reminds us of not only the dangers of military aviation, but even more, paying the ultimate sacrifice of service to the nation in her defense. With Arlington National Cemetery as the backdrop, with its rows and rows of tombstones, we are reminded of the many men and women who have given their lives in defense of this great nation, and sadly recall other tragic military aviation losses in that defense, such as Extortion 17, another tragic crash of an MH-47 in Afghanistan, August 6, 2011, resulting in the loss of 38 lives, and Operation Red Wings on July 27, 2005 in Afghanistan, when a CH-47 crashed, taking another 19 American lives, and sadly on December 12, 1985, when a DC-8 crashed in Newfoundland, Canada, tragically killing 258 U.S. servicemen returning from a 6-month peacekeeping deployment in the Sinai. In sum, these very sad and untimely losses underscores the dangers of not only service in the profession of arms, but to the service of our great nation. Bound together in another twist of fate, today, the day we honor and remember the crash at Baker's Creek, there is also another historical significance. Today, June 14th, is the day the nation celebrates the Army's 242nd birthday. Therefore, it is befitting that Baker's Creek serves as a poignant reminder of the honor, service, and sacrifice of all our men and women who have served in the ranks of the United States Army and all our armed forces. From the searing jungles of the bloody Pacific to the brutal wastelands of Iraq and Afghanistan. We thank and pay tribute to the many who have fallen and paid the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms you and I enjoy here today. Before I close, I want to recognize and especially thank Dr. Robert Cutler, the son of Captain Sam Cutler, who scheduled the Bakers Creek flight on that fateful day and saw the men off just before the crash. Sir, it has been through your tireless efforts and those of the Bakers Creek Memorial Society that this memorial rests here today. Thank you, sir. I would also like to extend a special thank you to the Embassy of Australia. Thank you, Ambassador Hockey and Air Commodore Martin. We are honored by your presence today. And we are sincerely grateful for the Embassy's continued support and this annual remembrance ceremony since its dedication in 2009. I would also like to extend a sincere thank you to Miss Libby Garvey, a distinguished member of the Arlington County Board, an esteemed community leader and partner. We are honored that you have joined us today to be a part of this memorial ceremony. And finally, thank you to everyone joining us here today to honor these 40 American patriots, to ensure this part of history is never forgotten, and to express gratitude to their families for having borne their ultimate sacrifice. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Duggan. Our guest speaker is here representing Mackay, Queensland. It is my pleasure to introduce the historian returned and Services League of Mackay Chapter Australia, Colonel Retired Colin E. Benson.
Colonel Duggan, Ambassador Hockey, fellow Australians and friends in America. Happy birthday to the US Army, sir. And also Flag Day. 25 years ago, a permanent monument was erected by the citizens of Mackay honouring the sole survivor and the 40 American servicemen who died in the Flying Fortress air crash at Bakers Creek during World War II on the 14th of June, 74 years ago today. This year marks the 74th anniversary of what we described as Australia's worst air disaster. In terms of loss of life, it proved to be the worst accident involving a transport aircraft in the Southwest Pacific War. These US Army troops were being returned to the jungle battlefields of New Guinea to help protect Australia from enemy invasion. Wartime restrictions, censorship at the time prevented local newspapers and radio stations from reporting the accident. Consequently, the accident was barely heard outside of Queensland. However, thanks to a number of diligent people, the story of these young American servicemen lives on in our memories. I wish to make special mention of former Queensland Senator the Honourable Santo Santoro of Brisbane. For more than a decade, Mr Santoro helped establish cordial relationships between the Australian ambassador and the American family members of the crash victims. In May 2006, he was instrumental in sending a block of Queensland pink granite to serve as the pedestal for that monument, which says honoured a gift from the people of Queensland and the Government of Australia. It is such conscientious people who keep the spirit of these fallen servicemen alive by supporting these annual commemoration events. We remain grateful to the 40 American servicemen who gave their lives at Bakers Creek and to their families whose personal grief we have long shared. Next year, June the 14th, 2018, will mark the 75th anniversary of the tragic wartime crash. The memorial is unique in another sense, for it is one of the few memorials globally to honour foreigners. Our Australian memorial was unveiled on the eve of the 49th anniversary of the wartime tragedy that shocked the local community, who had taken the crew and the passengers into their hearts and into their homes. Our Mayor also referred to a clever piece of journalism by the editor of the day in 1943 that has been likened to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In a tongue twister, Gregg said, "Due to the censorship at the time, nothing was able to be said. But in true journalism form, they did say it, they just didn't say it." I refer you to a copy of that piece of journalism. In my friend Bob Cutler's books, either the Bakers Creek air crash that was released this year, Mackay's Flying Fortress, which was the first edition in 2003, and the 70th anniversary edition, Australia's Worst Air Disaster. It's called We Share Their Grief. Mayor Williamson acknowledged in the community on both sides of the big pond, the Pacific Ocean that separates us, also laps our shores to unite us. A memorial, he said, doesn't mean anything unless as a community we come together to remember. And every year on this day, for the 25 years since its inception of our memorial, the community has indeed remembered. Remembered to the point that it is now remembered in the United States. And in closing, the Bakers Creek story continues. During the last 25 years, we have searched for and traced 39 of the 40 families of the fallen warriors. The aim has been to inform them of the circumstances beyond the very simple message that came in telegrams they received several days after the crash, and also when the remains were repatriated in late 1947 or early 1948, which was very distressing to the families because it said their loved one had been interred twice in Australia and there was no explanation. Thank you for this opportunity to strengthen the bond between our nation that is as strong as when we first went into battle together, the Battle of Hamel in France on July the 4th, 1918. Thank you for your opportunity, lest we forget.
Thank you, Colonel Benson. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Bakers Creek Memorial Association, Dr. Robert S. Cutler.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for this lovely place with the sun shining and the rain not coming down. Thank you, Colonel Duggan, Air Commodore Martin, Ambassador Hockey, Chaplain Rivera, Mrs. Garvey, and the Reverend Beverly Seary, and other distinguished guests. On behalf of the Bakers Creek Memorial Association, that's the families and friends of the crash victims, from 23 states across the United States, we thank you for your thoughtful remarks and your leadership in conducting this annual ceremony to affirm the values that those 40 members of the Army Air Corps died for in World War II. And to the members of the Mary Washington chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution, and the 317th Veterans Group, our co-sponsors, who are also with us today. And to our Australian friends, Air Commodore Gary Martin, the ambassador from the embassy, and to Colonel Colin Benson, the RSL historian, again with us from Mackay, Australia. We thank you for your continued support of our binational cause to acknowledge the lasting bonds of military security and friendship between our two nations that began in Gallipoli in World War I and strengthened itself in 1942 at the New Guinea at the Kokoda Trail, and still exists today. Like other patriotic commemorations, we believe it important, indeed our duty, to pay tribute and to remember this historic event. The unique feature of this tragedy, not simply the number of deaths, but rather the extraordinary loss that occurred to so many American families and Australian friends simultaneously. Last Sunday, as we've heard, in Mackay, Australia, the city celebrated its 25th anniversary of the Bakers Creek Memorial Monument, dedicated by their mayor and city council on May 11th, 1992, to commemorate the Allied forces' victory in the Pacific in World War II. Next year, June 14th, 2018, will mark the 75th anniversary of the tragic Flying Fortress crash. That ought to be a significant public event in both countries. Please stand now and welcome Ms. Claire Gailey, the daughter of the late Lieutenant Colonel C.K. Gailey, a former board member of our Bakers Creek Association, and Colonel Colin Benson, the Mackay RSL historian. Claire will read the names of the fallen as we place flowers of remembrance in this green basket next to the monument, followed immediately by a moment of silence. Then Col Benson will recite the Ode, a traditional Australian battlefield benediction. If anyone would like to place a flower, please step forward and take one from the orderly to your right and place it in the green basket next to the monument. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bob. Private First Class Jerome Abraham. Captain John O. Berthold. Technical Sergeant William A. Briggs. Sergeant Dean H. Bussey. Technical Sergeant James A. Copeland. Sergeant Carl A. Cunningham. Staff Sergeant Lavelle Dale Curtis. Technical Sergeant George A. Ehrman. Flight Officer William C. Erb. Private James E. Finney. Sergeant Leo E. Fletcher. Technical Sergeant Alfred H. Fressa. First Lieutenant Vern J. Gidcombe, Jr. Private First Class Norman J. Getz. Staff Sergeant Roy A. Hatlin. Staff Sergeant John W. Hilsheimer. Private First Class Vernon Johnson. Sergeant Donald B. Kuiper. Staff Sergeant Charlie O. LaRue. Private Raymond D. Longabaugh. Private First Class Kenneth W. Mann. Corporal Marlon D. Metzger. Private Charles D. Montgomery. Second Lieutenant Jack A. Ogren. Private First Class John W. Parker. Private First Class Frank S. Penksa. Major George N. Powell. Sergeant Anthony Rudnick. Corporal Charles W. Sampson. Private First Class Arnold Seidel. Corporal Jacob O. Skaggs, Jr. Corporal Franklin F. Smith, Corporal Raymond H. Smith, Private First Class Frederick C. Sweet, Corporal Edward Tenney, Sergeant David E. Tileston, Staff Sergeant Frank E. Welchel, Private First Class Charles M. Williams, and the survivor, Corporal Foy Roberts.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
Thank you, Dr. Cutler, Sarah T. Cutler, Claire K. Gailey, and Colonel Benson. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our ceremony. Joint Base Myer Henderson Hall Commander, Colonel Duggan, invites you to join him for some refreshments. Thank you for your attendance this afternoon.